Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. My name is Mara. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an advocacy associate at the Women's Environment Development Organization, and I am also a member of the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition, which is a coalition of really incredible feminist, racial justice advocates, economic justice advocates, and global justice advocates based in the US who are thinking really deeply about how to bring a feminist lens to the Green New Deal in the US, but also thinking about the ways that the Green New Deal as a vehicle really is talking about what a transformative agenda that really addresses some of the root crises of the root causes of the climate crisis, which we know to be patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and extraction, and capitalism, and thinking about how we can build a better world with a more feminist, just future that is coming from the solutions from communities that have had them for a long time. So I'm really thrilled to be here today with a panel of really incredible feminist advocates from the FemG&D, and I am really hoping to hear from them how we are thinking about the ways that a Green New Deal in the US, unless it really is thinking about the ways that global justice and transnational solidarity and care and repair is at its center, then we are not building a transformative vision that will actually work for all. So I'm going to pass to my left to Jacqui Patterson to share a bit more about how she's thinking about this.
Thank you so much. So in April of this year, near the 100-day mark of the current U.S. administration, I wrote an entreaty to the administration called Memo to the Biden Administration, What Not to Do on Climate. And now as we approach the 300-day mark for the administration and enter this UNFCCC space, I wrote another missive called Message to COP26 Negotiators, Capitalism Never Really Worked Out for the Earth, or for BIPOC communities. In both of these, I basically said the same thing that we've all been saying and will continue to say until those in power get the message, that the policies, practices, and processes that comprise the trappings of a capitalist economy, a predator activist economy, are what has us on the road to perdition with catastrophic climate change, calamitous COVID-19 pandemic, an economic crisis that's related to both, and the racial awakening in the United States that is converging on frontline communities. While the real solutions are already being modeled for us in the principles, the existing projects, and the awesome possibilities of frontline community leadership. Continuing to expand oil drilling, Trayvon Martin, Philando Castile, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, George Floyd, the list of those who haven't survived a police state that targets Black, Indigenous, and Latino people are too many to name. Failure to regulate pollutions imperiling the planet and sickening the BIPOC communities in the sacrifice zones that surround polluting facilities. The fact that the US is 4% of the global population, yet 25% of the emissions that drive climate change, yet when people come to our borders, people not seeking riches, just seeking to survive, they are met at the border with cages. They're met at the border with agents on horseback using their reins as whips to corral people who are seeking refuge. In the words of Warshan Shirray, a Kenyan-born Somali poet, no one puts their children in the boat unless the water is safer than the land. So allowing the corporatocracy to proliferate as big fossil fuel, big ag, big pharma, and others continue to hold sway over our democracy, all of these are examples and more that tell the story of a runaway extractivist economy built on exploitation and domination. Yet on the positive side, we find hope in the work of frontline communities and climate justice leaders across the country and across the world who are really teaching us that the solidarity economy models provide what rejects the falsehood of scarcity and embraces the reality of abundance. Through the Hoodwinked in the Hot House volumes 1 through 3 that the Indigenous Environmental Network and others put together, they lay out the false solutions from geoengineering to carbon pricing and beyond that we must denounce. In places like Chicago, they fought back against coal-fired power plants. In Portland, a multi-stakeholder coalition put together a group a set of principles that became legislation called the Portland Clean Energy Fund. From the Soul Fire Farm in New York to the Earthseed Permaculture Farm in California, Black women are showing how local food systems can provide access to healthy and nutritious foods while shifting away from unsustainable agricultural practices. From the Black Mesa Water Coalition to the Solar United Neighbors to Solidarity, communities are leading in a transition to a clean energy economy. From Zero Waste Detroit to Free Your Voice in Maryland, communities are winning campaigns around permitting of incinerators. From the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to the Dakota Access Pipeline to Line 3, communities are rising up and fighting back against fossil fuel infrastructure. In Alabama and Georgia, Black Voters Matter and the leadership of Black women were credited with saving democracy in the face of efforts to suppress inclusive government. In closing, with principles and practices and policies that mimic natural systems, the real nature-based solutions of regenerative design and cooperative systems, we can redesign our societies in a way that celebrates the abundance of what the earth yields, grounding ourselves in values such as caring for the sacred and preserving ecological well-being. We can learn to live in harmony with the earth and with each other, learn from the people who already do so. Establishing systems rooted in deep inclusive democracy, we can govern ourselves in a way that uplifts all rights for all people, ensuring that no one is left behind, and living up to the tenets of what's supposed to be our nation in terms of liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqui. Over to you, Katherine.
Thanks, Mara. Thanks, Jacqui. Tox Kulawa in Nwas Mewitulu in Nwas Numu, Lixiu, Nimipu. Good evening, everyone. My name is Katherine. I am Paiute, Cayuse, and Nez Perce, a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla in Oregon, and the Communications Coordinator for the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, as well as a member of the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition in the U.S. I'm honored to be here with these amazing leaders of so many movements that represent so many spaces. And you know, as Jacqui was speaking to, you know, women, femmes, non-binary people, LGBTQ+, two-spirit relatives in the US and globally are being hit hard by the climate crisis, and specifically Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities, communities of color, low-income communities, and communities in the global South are bearing the brunt of these impacts. Since European contact, capitalism, colonization, and patriarchy have been working hand in hand to erase Indigenous communities through physical violence, violation of Indigenous sovereignty and rights, and destruction of the lands and communities we call home. And these systemic impacts are further compounded by the governments and fossil fuel industries that walk these halls here today and continue to invest trillions in climate chaos and destruction in our communities. We see these impacts across the country in the man camps, which house workers from outside of our communities, along the pipelines where Indigenous women and girls are murdered, raped, and missing. Today we held an action this morning, and this is why I'm wearing this sticker, to honor those people who have been taken from us. You know, it's, I don't want to get too emotional about it, but all of us have these stories, and it's and this is an epidemic that I want to highlight and that we gave honor to today this morning. And please look for more information about that. We also see this along pipeline fights like in Minnesota on Line 3 and in all of our tribal communities where sovereignty is violated as mines, pipelines, and other extractive projects are built without consent or respect. And all the while, we continue to show up in these spaces that don't want us. We continue to stand for our communities and the earth. We continue to fight for our rights as a continuation of the love and power of our ancestors, to fight for future generations and for all of us to have a healthy and thriving planet. 80% of the biodiversity left on the earth exists within Indigenous territories, primarily because of our relationship to nature. And we are fighting to protect our sovereignty and rights, and that is important for all of our futures. Each of our communities carries a vast wealth of traditional ecological knowledge on how to live in right relationship with the land. In my community and in many Indigenous communities, women are critical to holding this knowledge and vital to passing that on to future generations. So it makes sense that Indigenous women's leadership is also vital if we want to save our planet. As governments continue to meet and negotiate our lives away, making announcements of empty promises and hollow commitments, we know that there isn't a path forward to resolve to mitigate the climate crisis without Indigenous peoples. Through the Feminist Green New Deal and many other initiatives, which I think Jacqui laid out, a lot of those grassroots solutions and a lot of stuff that's happening on the ground, we're calling for Indigenous rights and sovereignty to be upheld and include in all levels of climate policy and negotiations. This includes binding legal recognition of Indigenous land rights, real enforcement of the vital framework of free, prior, and informed consent laid out in the UN Declaration on Rights of Indigenous People, and recognition of the rights of nature. In this time of colliding crises and failing infrastructure, there's a moment to build back better, and this is the time to dismantle these detrimental extractive systems that are harming our communities, and instead invest in climate policies grounded in feminist solutions, human and Indigenous rights, and justice-based approaches. Katsiaoyao, thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. Over to you, Osprey.
Thank you all. It's really an honor to be on this panel with all of you. My name is Osprey, Orielle, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network and also part of the Feminist Green New Deal. And for those of you who are interested, if you go to our website, we have a whole set of principles that might be interesting for you to look at that has a deep analysis of our collective work together. And I think it's really important in the context of the COP to recognize that we are the Feminist Green New Deal in the United States, in a northern country, in a wealthy country, and our responsibility. So I think it's really important to say that one of the reasons that we're collecting together is the harms that we are experiencing at home and frontline communities, Indigenous, Black and Brown, and Black and Brown communities in the United States, and the inequities experienced there and the injustices and racism that are happening in the United States right now, but also in the context of coming here to this global forum. The United States also has an outsized impact on the rest of the world as we pass around our white supremacy and our ideologies that are very harmful of patriarchy and capitalism, racism and colonization. So I just really also wanted to recognize that we are a wealthy country and what we represent here to a lot of global South countries and that responsibility that we have. I just wanted to make a few quick points about the fact that Global Witness and other organizations yesterday reported that fossil fuel lobbyists at COP26 outnumber even the largest country delegations. So let's really I think we need to talk about the elephant in the room here, which is that still the Paris Climate Agreement does not talk about fossil fuels. And that means that no gas, no coal, no oil is talked about in the Paris Agreement. And we need to understand how much the fossil fuel industry is operating in this space and still influencing what the outcomes are. And I don't think that we can overlook this. We know that, as an example, 60 of the largest banks in the world have collectively financed $3.8 trillion in fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement. And the recent report by the UN Environment Program found that governments still plan to produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels in 2030 than what would be consistent with limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And we simply cannot move forward with these numbers. We don't want net zero. We want real zero. We want pollution stopped at the source. And this is something that the Feminist Green New Deal is really advocating for. And bringing this back around to the Feminist Green New Deal, again, we really want to have a gendered and racial approach to our work. Earlier this year, we put out a report on the gendered and racial impacts of the fossil fuel industry on frontline communities. And the impact of the fossil fuel industry in Indigenous, Latinx, and Black communities is outrageous. The health impacts are absolutely heartbreaking. So if we don't really address this relationship between the government and the fossil fuel sector and how there's a revolving door going on here, I don't think we're going to get to where we need to go. And so we are bringing the question forward, where are the government leaders? And I'm talking about those in the United States at this moment, but it's also global. Where are the government leaders willing to stand up to the fossil fuel industry? We need to shut them down because we can't just do this through carbon reductions. We need to do this through stopping pollution at the source and getting on with the just transition. And we need that $100 billion to go to the Global South to help with this transition, and we need it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Osprey. Over to you, Frances.
Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Frances Roberts-Gregory. I am a Southern feminist political ecologist. I'm also a second-generation critical environmental justice scholar activist. I am academically affiliated with the University of California, Berkeley, Northeastern University, and most recently, the Hive Fund for Climate and Gender Justice. Most importantly, however, I am a descendant of formerly enslaved sharecroppers, blue-collar workers, as well as immigrant and migrant workers from the Deep South and the northeastern part of the United States. Today, I represent my multiple communities throughout what I like to call the East Coast diaspora, as well as my strong aunties, grandmothers, and a single mother who survived Jim and Jane Crow, as well as resisted the intersection of environmental racism, sexism, and classism. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to be a feminist scholar, activist, and environmental educator, as well as how the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal has brought me into the folds of feminist climate justice and created opportunities for international solidarity. So I currently live in Bulbancha. You may know it as New Orleans, but the original name is Bulbancha, which means a place of many tongues. This is a Choctaw word, and this is a region that was home to over 40 tribal communities, including the Chitimacha, Choctaw, Caddo, Tunica, Biloxi, Atakaba, Ishak, and Homa. It's also home to many folk from Honduran and Vietnamese diasporas, as well as indigenous folk of African descent from all over the world. Sadly, this region is also on the front lines of climate, environmental, and energy justice, as well as disaster capitalism. Most recently, my home was impacted by Hurricane Ida, and I actually had to evacuate with my cat and my partner for over 3 weeks. We traveled throughout the Gulf Coast. We ended up in Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi in search of emotional and physical safety. Fortunately, I was inspired by the mutual aid and solidarity efforts of groups on the ground, such as Another Gulf is Possible, the Bulbancha Collective, Healthy Gulf, and folk along Cancer or Death Alley who are fighting petrochemical industries, as well as Formosa Plastics. So as a feminist scholar, activist, and environmental educator, I believe that we have an important role in bringing the intersectional analysis that is required for a feminist agenda for a Green New Deal. We also play an important role in politicizing the youth who are the future and current environmental leaders. And we also have a role in we have an important role in demonstrating that education policy is actually climate justice policy. As feminist scholar activists, we bring the epistemological and methodological tools to conduct community-based research. We also ensure that we can bring about sustainable development goals, such as quality education and gender equality. We are the ones that ensure that we can manifest these feminist futures. So in closing, I don't think we can build back better or imagine decolonial futures without centering feminist priorities for climate justice, as advocated for our color campaign, the Women and Gender Constituencies color campaign. We have our mask here. I also think that the Feminist Agenda for a Green New Deal gives me hope that we can center care jobs as green jobs, that we can educate youth using critical feminist pedagogies, and also that we can build back better with less concrete and less gray infrastructure and more permeable pavement, blue-green infrastructure, while ensuring that we're advancing reproductive justice, as well as decriminalizing environmental defenders in the global north and the global south. Finally, we are the climate abolitionists and self-emancipating people that will center truth-telling in our healing work. So together we can manifest the wild, pleasurable, playful, humorous, fugitive, and abundant feminist futures that are required for all of us to thrive and survive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to be here. My name is Sandra Dennis. I'm the executive director of the Miami Worker Center in Miami, Florida. I'm also a proud member of the the Grassroots Global Alliance, and am honored to be a part of the delegation called It Takes Roots. I'm so inspired by my sister, Frances, who just spoke, and it reminds me that I come from a people that are revolutionary. I am Black, I am Haitian, I'm a woman, and what we do is we resist. I have lived through Hurricane Andrew, Irene, Irma. I've been impacted by earthquakes and storms galore. My people are in Haiti and have watched abroad and throughout the Caribbean. What we are doing is not working. Folks are calling for transformative practices. I'm actually saying we need to listen and learn from the ways of those who are often forgotten and exploited, my people. Right? They know the earth, they work the land, they're in relationship with the land. Our indigenous Black and brown sisters from across the globe who protect our water and our land. They care for our children and the sick. They work the land and bring forth food to eat, and are the ones that are forgotten when we're in these spaces that are so beautiful, but actually know what it takes to make sure that we are still here when disaster strikes. Climate disproportionately impacts women, girls, gender nonconforming folks, and we see that firsthand. And the question I often ask is, who's left behind? Who's forgotten? When folks are able to migrate, who's able to migrate, who's not able to migrate, right? And not only who's left behind, but who's also often the first responders, right? And the first responders are, again, the care workers. And so we demand, right, real reductions and real solutions. And the solutions seem transformative to people, but what I'm saying and I'm calling out is actually there are what we know already exist, right? I too come from a family who have worked the land and continue to remind us that it's important for us to take care of the land, take care of the water, because that is what we have. Again, what I am saying in terms of a feminist approach is that we invest in care worker, and that we divest from industries that extract and that will poison us and will kill us, right? Instead, let's invest in the very industries that will care for us, not only us as people, but the environment that we're a part of. I am reminded, lastly, that the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Our tools are resistance and going back to what we know is true, our ancestral practices. I have 2 minutes. Our ancestral practices and what have been passed down from generation to generation. Thank you so much.
Whew, thank you all. Thanks y'all for your leadership, for your wisdom, for your power, and I think most of all for your vision. You know, I think these folks have lifted up some of the principles that Osprey pointed to that the Feminist Green New Deal sees as our anchor for our organizing and our advocacy, and just a few among them. Jacqui pointed to needing to heed the leadership of Black and Indigenous and communities of color. Katherine pointed to honoring Indigenous sovereignty and protecting environmental defenders as our priority within climate action globally and in the US. Osprey pointed to really needing to reject false solutions and demanding real accountability from governments. And Francis pointed to seeing international solidarity as our foundation, right, as our foundation. And Santra talked about the need to really divest from harm in all of its forms, meaning militarism, extraction, and exploitation, and really investing in systems of care that care for all of us and keep us safe and healthy. So I think when I'm thinking about the vision that these folks have painted in front of us, it reminds me of a quote that many of you have probably heard from Arundhati Roy, who says, "Another day is possible, and on a quiet day, you can hear her breathing." So I don't know about y'all, but I feel like I have heard her breathing a little bit in this panel. And I thank you for lifting up the solutions that we know are here. I thank you for lifting up the wisdom that we know exists in these halls, even though it sometimes does not get heard enough. And I thank you for bringing movement to this space and demanding that climate justice needs to have gender, racial, and economic justice at its core, or it is not for us, and we will not stand for it. So I'm going to open it up to questions now. I also will point folks who want to learn more about the Feminist Green New Deal to the website, feministgreenNewDeal.com, where you can find recent resources and webinars and teach-ins that folks in the coalition are doing, particularly around the care and climate intersection, and much more. That's feministgreenNewDeal.com. So I'm going to open it up to questions now if folks have anything that they'd like to follow up on or ask of the panel.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm Sasha Gabrizon with WCF. My question would be about new announcements by Biden and that he got a deal on the infrastructure. And how are you going to make sure that this will indeed also be in line with the principles of Feminist New Green Deal? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to answer that one? How are we going to hold Biden accountable?
I mean, many thoughts, right? You know, we would like to remind the administration to really look into the data around who turned out to vote and who ensured that that administration has an opportunity to be of service to the people. We're also reminded that infrastructure without people is nothing, right? You actually may not have people to enjoy this new infrastructure that you want, right? And so to me, in a developed country, like we like to say in quotes, it is sad that we're still thinking and trying to fight for parental leave, right? For us at the Miami Worker Center, the astronomical cost of childcare, right? People are choosing between, you know, having to go to work or taking care of their children, right? We're also talking about, you know, the ability for, you know, going to college, access to college was, you know, wiped off immediately. So there's still a lot of work to be done. And again, you know, I have to ground myself, and we talk about this within the Alliance as well. You know, how do we ensure that the people that we elect don't back out of what they promised us, right? And again, we have to resist, we have to stand up. Again, the master's school will not dismantle, right? So if we are thinking out of the kindness of our hearts that government will do right by us, I don't believe in that. I believe they have to feel the pressure, they have to hear from us. And that is why we're here to say that there are people all over, not only the United States of America, but all throughout this globe who are standing up to their leaders saying, you represent us. You're paid by our tax dollars, right? And these are the things that we need in order to ensure. And truthfully, if those things are not taken care of, we again will find ourselves in even worse conditions that we will have to reckon with. And those are my comments to the administration.
I would also add that Biden ran on a campaign promise to stop fossil fuel extraction and expansion. And now we have this package, and we didn't get everything we wanted, certainly on the climate front. It was a real battle, and I won't go into the politics of that, but I know from the position of the Feminist Green New Deal, and certainly a lot of other frontline groups in the United States, there's going to be a lot of advocacy and work through civil disobedience to ensure that there is no more fossil fuel expansion or extraction. We just went through a huge battle with Line 3. We were very engaged with that, with Indigenous leadership, of course, at the forefront. It was brutal. I mean, people, I know people who were subjected to pain compliance for standing up for their water. We have a real battle in the United States with the front lines. Formosa plant was mentioned, where it is literally killing Black people and their communities with the health crisis that's going on with these fossil fuel plants and petrochemical plants that are going up. So to me, a big part of this is going to really come down to, you know, what are the promises on climate and how that's going to affect frontline communities, and how much we really need to continue to push as hard as we can to keep these promises around stopping fossil fuel extraction and expansion.
And I would just add really quickly that this really goes back to one of our principles, centering youth leadership, because youth are making a big difference in advancing our priorities, as well as ensuring that holding the Biden-Harris administration accountable. And that goes back to education, what I said earlier about how education policy is climate policy. So you have to ensure that we're mentoring and politicizing our youth, so such as folk we saw Fridays for Future, Sunrise Movement, what have you, to make sure that they're actually holding their parents, because a lot of these policymakers, they're parents as well, they're caretakers, making sure that they're making policies that will ensure a livable and just future. So definitely centering youth leadership will hold these policymakers accountable. And we actually have allies. Some of our policymakers were here today wearing our masks over the week. So we have allies who actually are trying to make sure that this language is included in these final documents.
Thank you all. So I believe we're at time, and I'll close by reminding folks of one last principle that has not been lifted up yet, which is the feminist principle that there is no such thing as domestic climate policy, which is why we are here. It's why we are here advocating that if global justice and policy that is centered on care and repair and moving money and power and resources is not at the center of US policy, then we won't have it. It is a betrayal of international solidarity, and it's a betrayal of a feminist climate justice vision. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all to the panelists for sharing your wisdom and your leadership and your vision. And I think we'll be sticking around in case anyone has any more questions, but thank you all for being here.